Welcome back to Revolutionary Roads, a podcast of the North Carolina History Project here at the John Locke Foundation. It's a podcast where we are walking through North Carolina's very rich history of what this state did during the American Revolution. Episode 1 was about the spark before the flame, when we talked about the War of Regulation and the regulator movement in the backcountry and in the Piedmont of North Carolina. And this time we are talking about what happened in 1774 as we are getting closer to the Revolution, and we see some women in Edenton, North Carolina, really take a stand against the British Crown. Now, to walk you through the history so far, before we get to our guest, so the War of Regulation happened sort of 1768 through 1771, and then we had the Battle of Alamance in May 16th, 1771. 2 years later, the British Parliament passes the Tea Act, and that's going to be a critical part of the conversation we have today. That's in 1773, and then the Boston Tea Party happens December 16th of 1773, and so that sort of sets the history and the story for where we are today in North Carolina history. Joining me today for this podcast is Donna King. She's Executive Vice President of the John Locke Foundation and Editor-in-Chief of Carolina Journal.
Thank you.
She was part of a mini documentary we made here at the John Locke Foundation called A Letter to the King about the Edenton Tea Party, which we're going to talk about today, and also won a Communications Excellence Award from the State Policy Network this year.
Right. We're so proud of that because this is just an amazing story, and it is really from the heart of North Carolina and who we are, and the pioneers, the female pioneers of the American Revolution and America's liberty movement that has permeated North Carolina even today.
Yeah.
You know, I see that passion and that energy in North Carolinians today, and it's so fun to talk about this. I'm looking forward to it.
No, it is. It's a great story, and folks can check out the documentary on YouTube. It's freely available to the public on the John Locke Foundation's YouTube channel, and it's a lot of fun to watch. I've watched it probably more times than I should have.
Me too.
But it's also playing at the Edenton Tea Shop, or Edenton Tea Company, which is a little tea shop in downtown Edenton if you go there today.
Where it all started.
And we're literally up the street from where it all started. But let's talk a little bit about these women.
Sure.
So the what happened in the War of Regulation was sort of the backcountry and in the Piedmont, but the real wealth and political power in North Carolina was on the coast.
Sure.
And in 1773, the British Parliament passes the Tea Act. And remember, they're in monstrous debt from the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, whichever one you want to call it. And so the British Tea Act says that you can buy as much tea as you want.
Right.
Except that it has to come from the East India Trading Company. It can't come from any other company. You can't import Dutch tea or anything like that. Now, financially, this was actually a deal because even with the tax, the 3-cent tax that was on tea at the time through the Townshend Acts from a few years before, British tea was still cheaper than any sort of smuggled in Dutch tea or anything like that. Right. But colonists took offense to it because it was literally the government telling them what they can and cannot buy.
Right.
And in a sense, it was forcing them to pay this tax. And that's where we start hearing sort of this call of taxation without representation. The folks in Boston, a little bit more hot under the collar than everyone else.
Sure.
Rush down to this ship in Boston Harbor in December of 1773, right?
Right.
And they throw 342 boxes or cartons or barrels or whatever of tea or chests of tea into Boston Harbor, and that's the Boston Tea Party, and they do this under disguise, all disguised as Mohawk Indians, right?
Sure.
And then the colonies sort of see a problem here. Parliament also sees a problem, pass a lot of legislation restricting trade to Boston specifically, but Massachusetts more generally. The colonies generally start seeing this as a problem, and they send delegates to the First Continental Congress. It's the Second Continental Congress that passes the Declaration of Independence, but the first one is going on. They meet, I believe, in September of 1774, and then we're in Edenton.
Sure.
So what's going on at Edenton at the time?
I love how this series is laying out the timeline, you know, because all of these things didn't happen in a vacuum. And this is a perfect example. The energy and the discord, the protest against this tea tax as a symbol of British control over the colonies was building and building. And, you know, who's serving it? Who's buying it? Who's doing all that? It's the women. Yeah. And what we saw happen in Edenton, which, as you mentioned, was really an economic center because it was trade. A group of 51 women from North Carolina gathered at the home of Penelope Barker, who was born in Edenton, and they signed a declaration pledging that they would boycott British tea, and they sent it for publication. They signed their names, as opposed to those who dressed under, dark of night in disguises to dump tea in the Boston Harbor.
Right.
These women,
those brave men in Boston,
in disguise in the dark of night. I mean, I'm not saying. I'm just saying.
Right.
But the women put their names. They put their names, their livelihood, perhaps their life, on the line to sign this protest. And it was led by Penelope Barker. And she's got an interesting history herself. But I think what it really spoke to was a tremendous amount of courage. They are true American patriots.
Yeah.
And they were one of the first of them right here in North Carolina.
No, they really were. I want you to tell me more about Penelope Barker.
Sure.
But before we do that, I want to talk about the term sedition.
Okay.
Sedition is not something that we deal with now, really, in modern day America. But at the time, it was a crime to sort of be seditious and be that openly rebellious of law and the people who made the laws. And so by signing their names to this declaration and then sending it to the king, they didn't just send it to the local newspaper and hope but nobody saw it. Look how brave we are. They sent it to the king. These women technically could have been prosecuted for sedition. They probably weren't because, look, royal control of North Carolina was tenuous at best. They weren't in New Bern. If they were in New Bern, it probably would have been different. It's hard to get prosecutors and police out to Edenton, and then they would have had local support. You're going to have to, that probably would have sparked a fire, but they were actually putting themselves at some legal risk at the time. They were.
Right? I mean, social and legal, and those two things are important. So, news and resources don't travel as quickly as they do today. So you got to put yourself in that time. You're right. Had they been in New Bern, it might have been a different situation. But really, it was considered treasonous to do what they were doing. And you didn't know if your next door neighbor was, a loyalist, was someone who was not openly, a patriot like they are, and were not as interested in bucking the crown to the degree that they are. So certainly, they took a tremendous amount of legal risk, but the social risk is the important thing. Penelope Barker using her, all of these women came from affluence. They're generally people who had a lot to lose economically and social status. Their spouses, their husbands were doctors, lawyers, things like that. So, there were high stakes for them. And so losing social status was another important thing. When they did this, London was just shocked. They were in horror. There were political cartoons about women just debating politics like it was a crazy thing. Today we don't really think about that as much, but to them, that was just insane that women would be getting involved in political protest.
Right.
So the view of the colonies, because of this, was really shaped in London as this, this treasonous, everybody there is crazy, and what are these women doing? So there was a lot of social penalties too.
Right. There's there was one sort of famous political cartoon came out lampooning the women of Edenton. You can look on the internet, but if you go to the Penelope Barker house in Edenton now, they have it framed, and it shows the women as they're loose women. They're not taking care of their children.
Exactly.
They're unkempt. I mean, it's just all of the worst things you can say about women at the time.
Right. Absolutely, it was an absolute commentary on it. And when you really think about what they were doing, and if you've ever had a chance to visit Penelope Barker's house, that's very much not the case.
No.
These are women of high social standing, but they also embody that American spirit. That American spirit comes from somewhere. It doesn't come directly from us. It doesn't necessarily come from these documents that we learn about or should be learning about in school. It's coming from a spirit and an attitude that we got in the 1700s. These are the women, and these are among the patriots that shaped the attitude that we're so proud of today.
Right. So in October of 2024, the town of Edenton celebrated the 250th anniversary of this. It was a very big celebration out there, and something they should be proud of. But Penelope Barker is at the center of this.
Yes.
Who's Penelope Barker? Tell us about her.
She's interesting. So she had been widowed twice by the time she even married Thomas Barker, who was her husband at the time that this happened. She was 40 when she married him, in a time when women, maybe lived till mid-60s, I think. And she, so with that comes, and you and I have talked about this, and now as I'm getting a little older too, there's a certain level of courage and irreverence and you lose that fear of what will people think. My goal is to protect my children, to protect the next generation, to protect a legacy. There's a certain level of courage that comes with age, and I think that's what we see in Penelope Barker.
Sure.
She gathered women of all ages, 51 women in her town. She had gathered through those being widowed twice, and now married to Thomas Barker.
How many? She had a pile of kids.
I believe so.
For three
Yes,
marriages,
she did.
how many?
She did. I'm not sure how many, but she had
9 kids.
She had quite a legacy to protect for future generations. But with being widowed twice and now married to Thomas Barker, she had some money. I mean, she had some inheritance, she had some affluence, she had some social status in the community, and there's some power that comes with that, and responsibility, though. And maybe that's what she saw, I think, in doing this, that she has a responsibility because of her status and her age to gather these women in her home and say, this is wrong. This is what we're going to do. And we are going to create this legacy for our children and our community and push back. And I think I just admire her so much because it would be hard to do today. It's hard today to stand up on social media and say what you believe in and push back on elected officials today. It's even harder to do it then against a king, especially when you have the division in the community that, we know what that looks like. And she was facing it too. It's not easy to do what she did. And I think that's what I admire about her so much, that she was really able to do something like this. She married Thomas Barker. He was a lawyer, a politician, so this is something that they talked about a lot, likely in their household. But this establishes her as one of an American pioneer, a true patriot in the sense that we think about it being a lot of men. Right. But she is somebody that goes down in American history as a true patriot and a pioneer.
Right. And he was gone. He'd been in England for a few years at this point. And so she's just doing this all independently of herself, just feels like it's the right thing to do. But, there's no man looking over her shoulder or telling her what to do. And, her husband didn't put her up to it.
No.
They probably actually had something to lose, especially with him being in England. I'm sure because he's there on business dealings, right?
Right.
And so she's putting something at risk.
Sure. Him as well, putting him at risk too. And all of these women really were doing that. They were taking their family name and they were putting it out there for ridicule and history. And there were women who decided they weren't going to, even if they believed in the same cause. There were women who said, I can't do this to my husband and to my family, and I'm just not willing to be there. 51 women were.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about how we put this in modern context. I think the bravest people in America right now are probably people who have anonymous accounts on social media. So, you get on X, formerly known as Twitter, and people who don't have a real name on there are they're just the bravest people on earth, right?
I know.
Because their name's not really on it. But these women put their actual names on it. They could be tracked down to Edenton. I mean, Edenton was a bustling port town on the Rowan River. And if you go to Edenton now and you visit the Penelope Barker house, it's right. They've moved it from where it had been, but it's right there on where you can just tell where the old port was.
Sure.
Easily. I wonder how we got away from, I guess, sort of that courage.
Right.
And maybe these women are the exception to the rule.
I think they are.
But I think there's something to be said of we get awfully mouthy behind a keyboard, especially when we don't put our real names on it. And yet these women are the exception for what I wish we would see more of.
I think so too. And you also have to remember that just like today, it's easy to, be doxxed and boycotted. And, a lot of these families owned businesses. They were attorneys. They were merchants. They were, prominent people in business, and you lose livelihood. It's not just your name out there; it's your livelihood too. And I think one of the reasons this was so courageous, and that I wish I, saw more of it, is because you did have to put yourself out there. If you compare it to the Boston Tea Party, for example, those who conducted the Boston Tea Party were in disguise, and they did it in the middle of the night, and these women were sitting around a table saying, look, we're not going to do it, and I'm going to sign my name to it. And it's not just saying we're not going to buy British tea. It is changing the heart of your household, which is their primary responsibility at that time. That's changing, the food that you buy, how you mend your clothes, how you run your household. These were, and products were not easy to get. We can't run down to Target and read the label and say, where did it come from? And I'm not going to buy this, and I am going to buy that. Although it seems like everything comes from China now anyway. But they didn't have those choices. They didn't have the resources available to them to make easy choices if they were going to boycott products. So they had to think about how their households ran. They had to think about how their family made an income if people were going to stop shopping from them, stop buying from them, stop using their services. Besides the idea of just being arrested or perhaps physically harmed by a loyalist. So this truly, truly was courageous in doing it, not just breaking the gender norms of how women were presented in society, but the real, true physical safety, how I make money and how I run my household.
Yeah, we honor and celebrate the Boston Tea Party in American history, and I'm not saying we shouldn't.
Of course, yeah.
But at the same time, it was just a few years ago, we had riots all over this country, right?
Sure.
And conservatives were very quick to talk about how, shouldn't harm people when you protest, you shouldn't destroy property when you protest, and the Boston Tea Party was, in fact, destruction of property.
Well, right.
Right?
Yeah.
But, and the philosophy that we're at the John Locke Foundation, and John Locke says, there is a point where you go through the political process, and then when you have no other options, then the people have a right to revolt.
Sure.
But it feels like these women are taking a step back and saying, we will go through the legal protest. We will sign a petition. We will put our names on it, and we will say this is wrong, and we're going to boycott. And hopefully this puts some pressure on the people who can make those decisions. Whereas it feels like the Sons of Liberty in Boston sort of rushed to not put their names on it and throw tea in the harbor.
Yeah.
They actually did destroy, and that's just an interesting contrast to me when we have the discussions about protests and riots today.
Well, and a main way we see protests is not just the organized things that we see with signs in the streets. A lot of our protest is just, a tweet or a black square on your Instagram or, whatever it is. It's not a lived sacrifice. What they did is a lived sacrifice, and that we don't see that today. So it really blows up this idea that you can protest without really making a sacrifice, because they did.
Right. I'm not trying to politicize this part of it, but I do want to know, how did this challenge gender roles at the time? We're talking about 1774 North Carolina.
No, well, women didn't sit at the table with men and talk about politics. They may have influenced their husband's perspective behind the scenes. Certainly, they wielded a tremendous. Women who were in this socioeconomic status wielded a lot of power in communities through social interactions, and perhaps that's what we're looking at here. Is that they're. Never underestimate a PTA mom or, a women's club or, what we see today. We know exactly what this is. The fact that they were not sitting at the table doesn't mean they weren't influential. And that's something that I think perhaps history has not emphasized enough, that they always seem like they were in the background. And perhaps they were in some of them, but, women had an immense amount of power during the freedom movement and the American Revolution. And they may be operating, outside of the spotlight in many cases, but they're using a tremendous amount of power, and they have opinions, and particularly women in this economic group are highly educated. They're able to make these kind of decisions, and their influence, remember Penelope Barker is from Edenton. Right. So they're influenced by their whole lives have been influenced by this idea of American independence. Their parents and their husbands, particularly as they get older in age, as Penelope Barker was, it just really is an important part of challenging what we think of as gender stereotypes from that time.
Yeah. Let's talk about Edenton. If people visit Edenton today, it's way out in eastern North Carolina. It's kind of a sleepy little town.
Sure. It's beautiful.
It's beautiful. It's a gorgeous little town. Yeah. I took my kids there for spring break this past year, and we had a good time for over 2 or 3 days there. But at the time, Edenton was a very important place in North Carolina. Can you talk about why it was important?
Well, and it's all about trade, right? Because it was a port. It was important because it was highly accessible by ships coming in and delivering goods to the colonies. Raleigh was, not even really a thought.
Yeah. And Edenton was a former capital.
And Edenton was the former capital. So this really was the town square of North Carolina. And I think that's the important part, is that Penelope Barker and these 50 women and 50 other women were not just, saying they're not going to buy tea. They really did move into that town square and declare it. And that's why Edenton is really an important part of that. And we don't hear enough about it, I think. Edenton was an important part because it was an incubator of freedom to some degree, because it was really run by economic principles.
Right.
This wasn't, a government-run city. It was it was free trade. Obviously we're talking about free trade and in favor of free trade, but it was run by economic principles that were the foundation, I think, of America's freedom and Americans' independence. So it really became this hotbed, this incubator of these ideas, and I think gave power to them and gave voice to them through things like the Edenton Tea Party. Right.
I think listeners who listened to our last episode will understand that a lot of the war of regulation and the protests in the Piedmont, and a lot of what we heard from people like Herman Husband and then the Sandy Creek Baptists was about the rule of law, and the rule of law being applied fairly among everyone. And that was going on, like I said, in the Piedmont and the western part of the state, but the wealth and the political power in the state was on the eastern part of the state. And the people in eastern North Carolina didn't really have all of the same problems that the people in the west were saying, particularly on how things were taxed. The fact that you had to provide hard currency when you paid taxes. People at port towns like Edenton and Wilmington, they had that. And so when, at the point that the Edenton Tea Party or the Edenton Resolves is being signed, right, we have the First Continental Congress going, and North Carolina sends 3 men.
Right.
And I think this is indicative of where the political power is.
Sure.
They send Richard Caswell from Wilmington.
Okay.
And Richard Caswell had been a colonel with Governor Tryon at the Battle of Alamance, fighting on the side of the royal governor.
Okay.
Right. So he's turned coat on this. There's Joseph Hughes from Edenton.
Okay.
And then there's William Hooper from New Bern. Nobody from not a coastal town.
Right.
And that's so what we have is people were already sort of angry at least the royal government in the western part of the state. And then this Tea Act really sort of congeals this overall protest with the East and the West, where they're starting to come together because now the problems that people were facing in the western part of the state have come home to roost in the port towns. And now everybody's mad.
That's so interesting. I don't think I ever really saw it that way. But, everybody loves the beach, right? You got to go there. But at the time, it wasn't about recreation. It really was about trade and ocean-going trade. And that's why we see them create that legacy for themselves. And that's one of the things that I pulled a quote from Penelope Barker from their letter to the king, which, of course, you can see Letter to the King on our YouTube. We, the ladies of Edenton, are determined to give memorable proof of our patriotism. Rather than part with freedom, we part with tea. And that speaks I love that. And it speaks to her desire to create a legacy for, her daughters, for daughters of America, for, long into the future, that this really was about leaving a legacy. It was about, of course, trade, and it was about independence. It was about all of these things, but it is about establishing an American spirit that respects our freedom, our economic freedom. Right.
No, I think that's exactly right. Of course, we talked about how they were sort of satired in British political cartoons, which probably, if they saw them, I'm not sure if they ever saw them, but if they did, they probably didn't feel too good about it. But what does it say about the fact that they were portrayed at all?
Right. Well, that's true. That tells you how important it was, because in London, I think that this raised some alarm bells in London, because they saw that this was happening, that if women were willing to stand up and do this, how deep does this run? And we saw following this more and more efforts, increased efforts to just clamp down on this idea of American sovereignty and American independence, because if women were doing this, then everybody must be mad, and there must be a huge problem. And so I think that this, the idea that they were portrayed as kind of loose and irresponsible and all of these other things was an idea to shape the narrative about what was really happening in the colonies. And you can see what Londoners wanted to believe was the case, and actually how blindsided they really were in the coming years.
Yeah. How do you think this shaped sort of where North Carolina was politically at that time and going forward from 1774.
Sure. I think it may really emphasize how important it was. Our agricultural history, our trade history, we were just geographically positioned in a really strong place. And I think that economically, that was an important piece of it too. And events like this showed, and, information travels more slowly there than certainly. Even today, North Carolina is always going to be one of those leading edge of the American South, where we have, a lot of economic strength and geographical good location. And I think that started then and gave us a lot louder voice in the years to come.
Sure. So we've had a lot of women-led political movements since 1774.
Right.
But not really at the time of 1774.
No.
This is very much an outlier. Do you think, this is obviously conjecture, but do you think the likes of Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth and that sort of, we're looking back to the Edenton Tea Party as an example?
I would like to hope so. I think that everything is built on the shoulders of giants. We have to look. I can identify with someone like Penelope Barker and those women today because, women are the very first ones that are vocal when there is an injustice in their community. I really do think that is true. Women jump up first when they see something like that. And I think that is a cultural cultural strength that we have in the United States, and it starts with women like Penelope Barker, and it has moved through the years with Americans from all over the country.
Yeah, what do you think it says about the power of a grassroots movement, which is really what this is?
Oh, for sure. This is the original grassroots movement, right? It really is. And I think they're all grassroots movements. It's how fast they get started and how wide they spread that they move into the mainstream. At this point, they're all grassroots movement. It's where they start, right?
Right.
But this really does speak to the power of it. And we saw, following this one, similar tea-related protests in other states.
Sure.
So it really kind of caught fire, and tea became a symbol of oppression.
Right.
And whether they, drank it or something else, then, this tea concept moved through communities in the colonies, and we saw more and more of it.
So October 25th, 1774
Yes.
is when the women of Edenton signed the resolves and they send their letter off. October 26th, 1774 is when the First Continental Congress ends.
Right.
And they passed a sort of a declaration and resolves affirming colonial rights and that sort of thing. And they also send that to the king.
Sure.
And so he's getting this double whammy on two different ships.
Ready.
Right. But this really sets North Carolina up and the rest of the colonies up for, okay, what do we do next? Because it's clear that George III isn't really going to stop.
Right.
Parliament's not going to stop. They have to pay off a national debt somehow, but they're also not going to give political representation to the colonies. And so what are you to do?
Right. Well, I think what this showed, that the Edenton Tea Party showed, was that they were not going to sit back and just take it. It really became apparent after the Edenton Tea Party, Boston Tea Party, then Edenton Tea Party, that no one was going to just take it, and it was not going to be a quiet ending.
Yeah.
And I think that up until this time, this moment, I think London was under the impression that this was just going to be another little skirmish in the colonies, but it was clear that the people were involved. It wasn't just the leadership.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a great episode. On our next episode, we'll talk about a document that is shrouded in some mystery in North Carolina history. We think it happened, but we can't prove that it happened because nobody has the original. It's the Mecklenburg Declaration. It's one of the reasons that we have two dates on the North Carolina state flag, and I look forward to talking about that because it comes just a few months after the Edenton Tea Party. Sure. And it's a great moment in North Carolina history. But thanks, Donna. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
And we hope that you all listen to the next episode.